75 Squadron was formed in Sydney in late February 1942 with this aircraft, the P-40 Kittyhawk. They were delivered in crates in early February 1942 when the ship carrying them to Java was diverted. It was to become one of the RAAF's most famous units. Equipped with these American-built high-performance fighters and with only 1 week's training, the squadron flew to New Guinea to try and stem what was then seemed the unstoppable tide of the Japanese seizure of the Southwest Pacific. The story of their deployment is told in an excellent book and a documentary by the same name, 44 Days. The opening clip is from that documentary. As 75 Squadron formed and started its initial flying in the Sydney area, around the region things were moving very fast. Singapore had already fallen, Darwin had already been bombed, and shortly after the squadron formed, the first attacks of Port Moresby occurred. HMAS Perth was lost, and then the Yarra. The speed of advance was quite extraordinary. The cost in pilots and aircraft was high. 12 died in the transfer from Sydney to New Guinea and the subsequent fighting there. They are buried in Port Moresby, Lae, Rabaul, and in both Macquarie Cemetery and Queanbeyan. A particular note, Sergeant Brown was captured near Lae and transported to Rabaul and brutally executed on or around the 28th of May 1942. A short distance from North Ryde RSL is the grave of Pilot Officer Lloyd Holliday, a 20-year-old husband, a son, and in fact a pilot in the RAAF. Lloyd was one of the first casualties of 75 Squadron. Only a few of the pilots had flown high-performance aircraft, because after 2 years of war, not one squadron of high-performance aircraft existed to defend Australia. By March 7, the aircraft was serviceable but yet to be fitted with radios. Those radios were in Townsville, so the planes were to fly north. These pilots had little experience on the aircraft, and 3 of planes and 2 pilots were to be lost before they left New South Wales. Flying Officer James Norton is buried in Queanbeyan near his family home. On the 3rd of February, Japanese aircraft began conducting damaging raids on the army garrison and the defences of Port Moresby. These raids were successful due to lack of Allied fighter aircraft opposition in the area. 75 Squadron's first commanding officer was Squadron Leader Peter Jeffrey, who had extensive experience in the Middle East flying the Kittyhawk with No. 3 Squadron, and it was fortuitous that this was the same aircraft the new unit was being equipped with. On March 19, however, Jeffrey handed over to the command to Squadron Leader John Jackson, another pilot with Kittyhawk experience in the Middle East, and he moved on to raise a sister unit, No. 76 Squadron. In order to provide some measure of air defence for the beleaguered garrison, the first ground elements of 75 Squadron began to move north from Townsville. Almost immediately afterwards, 75 deployed to Papua New Guinea. But the unit's pilots had an average of 9 hours flying time in the Kittyhawk, and they'd only fired their guns once. They'd already lost 3 aircraft coming up to Townsville and lost 2 more and 1 pilot in Queensland. Squadron Leader Jackson was an avid photographer, and much of these shots that you'll see in the following film came from his collection. On the 21st of March, the squadron aircraft landed at 7 Mile airstrip just outside Port Moresby. Unfortunately, the defenders of Port Moresby had only ever seen enemy fighter aircraft, and therefore As they saw the Kittyhawks arriving, they shot at them, and 2 were damaged. Fortunately, no pilots were injured. Lasting just 44 days, 75 Squadron thwarted the Japanese plans to capture the crucial airfield and the harbour. Their feat was an epic one. For nearly all of the 6 weeks on the front line, 75 Squadron was the sole fighter unit in the area, only being joined by the American units in the final week at Port Moresby. These are some of the pilots of 75 Squadron before they left for New Guinea. They were young men, mostly in their 20s, and yet to be affected by the climate and the combat that was to come. In this film here, they were being trained to fly the Kittyhawk out of Townsville. The film shows them doing briefings, pre-flight checks, taxiing and taking off. It was pretty much what they did do before they flew. They managed to get about 9 hours flying time in before it started, and they flew off to combat.
I am looking forward to fighting again, especially against the Japanese swine. We'll lick them too. I reckon I can fight 10 times as hard now that our shores are threatened. I've been given 75 Squadron and the rank of Squadron Leader. We expect to be in action in a few days, but it's no joke starting a squadron off from scratch. I'm flat out like a lizard drinking.
Gambling that the RAAF presence was not yet known to the Japanese, Squadron Leader Jackson decided to launch an attack on the Japanese airfield in Leh on the 22nd of March. The raid was an outstanding success, achieving complete surprise and destroying 3 bombers and 9 fighters on the ground and 2 more fighters in the air. Unfortunately, 2 of the Kittyhawks were taking part in the raid were shot down. Flying Officer Bruce Anderson was killed, and Flying Officer Wilbur Wackett had to undertake a 320-kilometre trek in order to make it back to Moresby. He had ditched his aircraft and swam ashore, dumping his heavy flying boots in the process. This made the trek even more amazing. 2 pilots actually made that trek back, one including John Jackson. And it's John Jackson's account to his wife, which is where the next clip comes from.
My aircraft sank in a few seconds. As I was swimming in, the croc poked his snout at me but didn't approve and turned away. The natives ashore seemed frightened, but 2 good lads, mission taught, offered to guide me. My feet are pretty bad. Staggered on all day yesterday. Towards the end, climbing a mountain. The boys took turns pushing me. Had some anxious moments wondering if the Japanese would catch up, as we could move only very slowly. My feet are the trouble. This morning they felt like 2 pulps, and I could hardly bear to touch them with my hand, let alone stand. I'm constantly wondering if you've heard I'm missing. I trust not. Struggled all day. Leeches by the million. Could have been snake sucking at me and I wouldn't have felt them. My feet were so sore. About noon, we struck some people. All the girls here wear nothing from the waist up and look most alluring. You can walk all day in New Guinea and, in the afternoon, see no distance away the place you left in the morning. A plane just arrived to pick me up. Was about to land when 3 Japanese made a surprise attack. Aircraft got full of holes. Had the tip of my finger grazed. Providence surely guided and protected me all through. Tons and tons of love, sweetheart, from your ever-loving husband, John.
Over the following weeks, 75 Squadron's aircraft were almost constantly in the air during daylight hours. Standing patrols, anti-strafing patrols and airfield cover patrols were conducted. The squadron also scrambled to intercept 32 incoming raids that varied in size and nature. Some consisted of bombers escorted by Zero fighters, while others were strafing attacks by fighters alone. 75 Squadron also conducted reconnaissance and strafing attacks on enemy positions in Ley, escorted US Army Air Force bombers on a bombing raid, and on one occasion even attacked a submarine. Control of the air was always contested but never lost to the enemy, despite heavy losses to the Australians, including the CO, John Jackson, 12 pilots killed and 17 planes lost to enemy action. On the 30th of April, 75 Squadron was joined by Air Cobra aircraft from the US Air Force, number 8 Pursuit Group. The arrival of the Americans was timely, as aircraft availability in 75 Squadron had become critical. Only 3 Kittyhawks were serviceable. The last operational sortie of the squadron's Port Moresby deployment was an interception of a bomber raid on the 3rd of May, which was jointly undertaken by the American Air Cobras and consisted of 75 Squadron sole surviving aircraft. On the 7th of May, the unit was ordered back to Australia for replenishment and a well-earned rest. To have formed and deployed into action within 17 days is an accomplishment that is without equal in the RAAF history and indeed any other equivalent Air Force. During its epic 6 weeks in the front line, the squadron claimed 35 enemy aircraft destroyed, 4 probably destroyed, and 54 damaged. The air defence of Port Moresby by 75 Squadron is a proud story of the Australians at war, fighting in desperate times, but also a warning to us. Time allows for training, for skills to be honed, spares to be accumulated, and ammunition stockpiled. Supply lines are now long as they were then, and it is a bit of luck those Kittyhawks were actually at sea in our area, for without them the story of New Guinea and in Kokoda track would have been very different. Today we have brave people to fly, sail and slog into battle, but their chances will be very much better if we make sensible decisions now and have the equipment built and proven.